Okay, so welcome to this teaching at LSE Platypus. Thanks to Dom for setting it up and everyone for coming. You have to excuse my voice because I've got a bit of a cold. And we'll be sipping on this tea. Everyone should have one of these like timeline maps. This is kind of a key to thinking about the kind of argument that I'm going to be putting forward, but also how to think about Platypus and its relationships to the left and to history more broadly. I should say, first of all, this teaching will be followed by another one next week, which will be on Trotskyism. So the presentation that I'm going to read was first delivered as a presentation to the Alliance for Workers' Liberty summer camp over this summer. So Dom, Padraig, myself, and some other Platypus members attended the AWL's summer camp, which they kindly invited us to participate in the conversation there. And I think this, the content of the paper is related to what's going on in the reading group syllabus at the moment. So you guys who are following the reading group syllabus, coming up to Lukács, or having just done some Lukács, are going to do some more. And this question of history and class consciousness is, obviously kind of theme for Lukács, so it's timely in that sense as well. But more importantly, I want to demonstrate, so I'm going to give I'm going to give a preamble to it because to explain the context of it, of the intervention, but also because I want this to demonstrate the kind of thing Platypus does, right? What is Platypus and what is it about? Because this question of being an educational project doesn't just mean having a reading group or holding activities on campus, but it means a kind of active engagement with the left such as it exists, because our approach to history is mediated through the left as a symptom, right? So we treat the existing left as a symptom through which we can think about the problem of the failure of Marxism and the death of the left. And that Platypus as a project, as an international project, is constituted on that basis. And that, you guys who are coming along and participating in the reading group and the coffee breaks, and the events like this and panel discussions which we hold on campus are basically participating in that work in some way. And obviously Platypus runs in these chapter-based this chapter-based setup where we have different chapters on different university campuses, but it's also an international organisation. And it's a membership organisation, and people who participate in the chapters can and should become members of the international organisation, and and participate basically in this educational project. So, to find out more about that, you should speak to Dom or myself or anyone else after this teaching. But it's something to consider, right? What are we actually doing sitting around reading Lukács, right? What does this amount to in terms of a broad historical perspective? What are we teaching ourselves to do? Where do we get this tradition in that the syllabus kind of lays out? And what does it mean to be framing the education that happens in the reading group in the context of the death of the left, right, and the kind of broader historical situation and the possibility for a new left. So in that vein, I'll just read a small, the opening line of the Platypus's statement of purpose, which was written around 2007, which says that Platypus is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. That's actually quite a high ambition, right? And we wouldn't set it any lower. The practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. But we think that in that process, the first task that faces us is to recognize the reasons for the historical failure of Marxism and to clarify the necessity of a Marxian left for the present and future. If the left is to change the world, it must first transform itself. So that's the kind of sensibility with which we're approaching Platypus beyond the reading group, right? Engaging with the left, going to left events, soliciting articles for the Platypus Review, trying to work our way through the symptomology that presents itself to us, because that's how we approach the history in that mediated way. Now, one of the things I want to kind of impress is that the left as an object is disintegrating and is actually changing over time in relation to political changes that are happening, within our lifetimes and within the sort of short period in which even I've been an adult, and the mere 10 years in which Platypus has existed. And when Platypus first started around 2006, 2007, around the anti-war movement in Chicago, it was, to say the left is dead and to talk about the reconstitution of a Marxian left had a certain meaning, because there were protests going on everywhere in which there were quote-unquote Marxists standing around handing out, trying to sell you their newspaper. And the sectarian left which Platypus encountered in those early years is not in the same state now than it was then. In the UK, for example, it's quite hard to, reconstitute for people who are becoming students now what the SWP was on campus even 5-10 years ago, particularly around the anti-war movement. This is even before my time, before I went to university. And so in our attempt to kind of educate ourselves about the history of the left through the left itself, we are actually faced with the problem of reconstituting the object, right? So going out and producing and kind of mapping for ourselves the left of the 20th and early 21st century in its disintegration, so that we can think about what that symptom is, right? It's not actually readily available on hand to us. So let's take this this teaching that was given at the AWL summer camp as an example. I went with Rory, who runs the Platypus chapter in Sheffield, to the AWL's conference, which was held at Birkbeck earlier this year. First of all, the AWL is the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. It's a Trotskyist organisation. Next week, Padraig will be talking about Trotskyism, and we can think about what kind of the history of British Trotskyism and what that means and where it's come from and so on. And they do entry work in the Labour Party, particularly through Momentum and a magazine called Clarion. They have another newspaper called Solidarity. Their website is Workers' Liberty. And we met one of their kind of main members there who talked to us. We were kind of raising questions from the audience from a kind of Platypus perspective, right? So how does what you're saying now about Marxism relate to what Marxism once was? kind of holding up the history that we'd been reading about in the reading group to these people who claim to be upholding it in the present. And they invited us to come up to their summer camp in the Yorkshire Dales over the summer. So we went there, and they have a kind of a series of internal education programs for their members, and we participated in those, and and I gave this presentation, and Padre gave the presentation on Trotskyism, and these were two specifically chosen topics to engage with what we thought was their symptomology. Right, so what are the kind of things that they're doing? And you'll see in the presentation, which I'll get into in a moment, that I'm specifically addressing a pamphlet written by their kind of lead organizer and thinking about their approach to it in the present. And what becomes clear, and this is kind of key to the Platypus perspective, is that their account of themselves and what they're doing in the present necessitates giving an account of Marxism in some way, and that their account of Marxism necessitates some kind of account of history per se. Right, so a kind of a pithy way of putting this that was formulated early on in Platypus is that one's theory of the present is one's theory of history, and vice versa. And so you can see that's what I've tried to lay out on this diagram, that the pamphlet I'm going to address is the blue one, the blue timeline, Unite the Left, by Sean McGamner and the AWL. And you can see how I try to show how it lines up onto a kind of a Platypus version of this history, and what they think the key dates are. And that actually one's account of this history, where one marks key transformations, is fundamental to thinking about what one thinks Marxism is. This question that we've posed for the series of teachings, what is Marxism, and also what one's practice is in the present. So when the left goes around saying Tories out, general election now, transform the Labour Party, what kind of theory of Marxism is do they think is informing that, and what kind of account of history? So I'll read the presentation. It will take about 20 or so minutes, and then we can talk about questions and stuff, and talk more about this diagram and how we're kind of mapping history in Platypus, and what that means. Okay, so Platypus declares, "The left is dead, long live the left." The left is dead, long live the left. But what does this mean? One aspect of this is that the left has regressed below the high point of historical consciousness in Marxism. The left has been in regression for a century, since the failure of the international revolution in the aftermath of World War I. In order to address this question of regression and Marxism, I want to address a pamphlet published by the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in 1998, titled Unite the Left and Left Unity in the Perspective of History. This pamphlet is particularly interesting because from the standpoint of its present, i.e. 1998, it attempts to give a theory of the death of the left through the metaphor of Marxism as the mythical Atlantis now sunk beneath the ocean. So I'll quote for you in full the proposition of this pamphlet. "There was once a great movement in all the advanced countries of the world, a movement for working-class socialism, for a great liberating revolution, for the full and consistent realization of the democracy that the bourgeoisie talk of but can never allow to develop properly and fully and in society as a whole. That great movement has vanished as completely as if, like the mythical continent of Atlantis, it has sunk into the sea. It is the great lost civilization of the 20th century, the civilization that might have been but never was. We, the Marxists, are the survivors of that Atlantis. We are its heirs. We are also the pioneers for its re-emergence," end quote. So it seems that in 1998, there were three aspects that provoked this kind of thinking. One, the Labour Party was seen not as a tool for socialist transformation. Indeed, this pamphlet that I'm talking about argues that it never was, but as an obstacle. Blairism made possible in a new way dispelling illusions in left Labourism. 2. The collapse of the USSR made left unity possible and desirable in a new way. And 3. The Trotskyist left was in total disarray, and the left more generally was in a very weak position. Thus, in their own way, the author declares the left is dead. Atlantis has sunk. In some way, Trotskyists have had to declare the left dead since 1938. Indeed, Marxists have had to do so since Luxembourg declared German social democracy a stinking corpse in 1915. But they did so precisely because such recognition might point a way forward. Let the dead bury their dead. Such sober reconsideration of the left in history, i.e. as is attempted in this pamphlet in 1998, is sadly absent today, when the excitement about the apparent upsurge for the left around Corbyn causes people's memories to shorten and the entire gamut of the far left puts aside the reconsideration of history in order to buckle up and knuckle down to the task at hand, join Labour. Okay, so this will be a bit of a tangent. I don't know exactly who wrote this pamphlet. It appears on their website as a kind of without a byline. So I'll simply refer to the author, but it is similar to other pamphlets by AWL founder Sean McGamner, and reproduces sections from another interesting pamphlet from 1996 titled Does the Labour Movement Need a Marxist Educationalist Group like the AWL? It's interesting to me that the set of conditions I outlined, which seem to have prompted such a reconsideration of the left in history, bear resemblance, albeit distorted, to the conditions that provoked a deep reconsideration of the left in history in the 1960s New Left, namely a crisis of Stalinism from 1956 onwards and a crisis of the Labour Party after the election defeat of 1959 and the internal crisis over Clause 4 and nuclear disarmament. This is what Ralph Miliband called the sickness of Labourism, hoping that such a diagnosis would prompt deep reconsideration on the left. It was in that context that Sean McGamner first cut his teeth in the Young Socialists, a Labour Party organisation which various Trotskyist sects ran, primarily the Socialist Labour League, of which McGamner was a member, through its youth newspaper, Keep Left. The New Left, however, failed to take this opportunity to break with Stalinism and Labourism, and found a Socialist Party anew. Since then, the left has naturalised the defeat of the New Left as a victory. In Platypus, we read an important essay from the tradition of the SLL, namely Cliff Slaughter's 1960 essay, What is Revolutionary Leadership, which I'll refer to later. So you can see on the timeline here, I've put in 1968 in brackets. It's not a date that the pamphlet will recognise as part of its own trajectory, but I think that in a way, the kind of crisis for the left in the kind of height of the Blair moment in 1998, and the way it attempted to reconsider itself and its history, sort of recalled the 60s in which McGamner was politicised and became a Trotskyist and so on. Okay, so back to the pamphlet. Having diagnosed the death of the left, the author has to attempt to account for how and why that happened. Why did Atlantis sink? Partly because such an account will determine what is to be done in the present. Such an account will have to be an account of history per se. Indeed, one's theory of history is one's theory of the present. Put differently, this problem raises the entire history of Marxism. What was Marxism? What was its problematic, and how did it seek to overcome it? One's response to such questions will inform one's sense of the meaning of Marxism's failure. Why did Marxism fail? The author lays out the history of the left in two sections. The first we might call the century of working class socialism, from 1838 to 1938, and you should be able to see this on the chart, i.e. from Chartism in 1838 to the founding of Trotsky's Fourth International in 1938. The second period we might call the 60 years of disintegration, from 1938 to 1998. In between those two historical sections of the pamphlet, there is a section titled The Marxist Left in Historical Perspective. In this section, the author tackles the problem of the failure of Marxism. They try to relate the problem of the disintegration of the left in the second period, 38 to 98, to the problems of the first period, 1838 to 1938. In order to do so, they raise the problem of class consciousness, right? So they try to explain the current situation based on history. And in order to do so, they raise this problem of class consciousness. What is the working class or proletariat such that it can have a consciousness adequate to overcoming capitalism? To refer to another symptom of the New Left, Moishe Postone, who recently passed away, he addressed this question in a peculiar way. If labour as a social relation constitutes the consciousness of the working class, how can it have a consciousness of the need to overcome labour, particularly if, as Postone observes, Marxism rejects arguments based on either an ontology of human nature, right? So the idea that there's some kind of human nature which rebels against exploitation in capitalism, and that's the consciousness which a kind of a liberatory movement would draw upon, or on a non-yet capitalized subject outside of the metropolitan centres. So some kind of third world subjectivity or other identity group that's somehow considered not yet subject to the consciousness of capitalism. So Marxism rejects both of these. Further, what is the working class or proletariat such that it leads to the reconstitution of capitalism as the crisis of bourgeois society, and of itself as a symptom of that crisis? Indeed, the mass working class movements of the 19th century did not end up leading to socialism, which did not mean the welfare state or even the welfare state plus full nationalisation with a workers' government, but the overcoming of bourgeois right, a value based on social relations of labour, and the overcoming of the state, leading to what Max Horkheimer later termed the self-regulating society, in which the infinite potential of human freedom could be pursued. Instead, those working class mass movements led to the trio that the Frankfurt School addressed under the rubric of the authoritarian state, namely Stalinism, fascism, and New Dealism, or welfare statism. So the pamphlet argues that the working class's consciousness of the problem of their situation and the necessary means for overcoming it is clouded by bourgeois ideas, which I take to be synonymous with the more traditional phrase bourgeois ideology. It argues that the working class is tied to bourgeois ideology in two ways. First, that they produce a layer of representatives at the trade union and parliamentary level because they do not have time to study and think. These representatives become close to the bourgeoisie and, quote, assume a middle-class way of life and outlook. They thus tie the workers to the bourgeoisie. Secondly, the working class have to live in the saturating ideological apparatus of what the pamphlet calls official society, which works to the benefit of, quote, the bourgeoisie and their working class agents. Right, so the argument in the pamphlet is that basically the natural consciousness of the working class would be to overcome capitalism. However, they're duped in these two ways. First, by official society, which is a kind of, I guess, an idea of a permeating set of ideas, and the other way is by its layer of leadership, which essentially gets bought off. Right, that's the idea. This approach to the issue of so-called false consciousness has been addressed in an article in a recent issue of the Platypus Review called The Ends of Philosophy by Chris Catrone. The idea here, i.e. in such theories of class consciousness, Catrone writes, is that somehow the workers would remain ignorant of their exploitation by the capitalists if they remained mired in bourgeois ideology. End quote. The job of socialists or Marxists, then, would be to warn the workers against adopting the idealism of the bourgeoisie. But this kind of class analysis, so-called, is not what Marx and Engels meant by ideology critique. When Marx set out to critique bourgeois ideology, he was referring not to the self-understanding of the capitalist class, but to the self-understanding of the working class movement for socialism. Marx was not the most ardent advocate for socialism, but its greatest critic. Beginning with the work of the French socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Marx showed that the demands of the workers for the value of their labour, that is, for their bourgeois right, and for the bourgeois ideals of a free society, which flowed from that, had become self-contradictory in the Industrial Revolution. Again, that's the kind of key turning point that's marked on the timeline. In Chartism and in the revolutions of 1848, The demand for democracy and the social republic led to the managing of society's crisis by the Bonapartist state. Socialism, as the highest ideology of the working class and the highest ideology of bourgeois society, was self-contradictory in capitalism, i.e. socialism was an expression of this self-contradiction of capitalism, and is a symptom of that self-contradiction. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that? This goes to the Marxist understanding of class itself. In the bourgeois revolution, the third estate, those who had no property other than their labour, were emancipated from the yoke of feudal social relations. The Abbé Sieyès proclaimed that the third estate had been nothing, but now it would be everything. Modern society is the product of this transformation. The overcoming of castes and estates, right, of a kind of feudal caste order, was supposed to produce the classless society of kind of cooperation. However, a new contradiction emerged in the Industrial Revolution, in which the bourgeois social relations of labour were outstripped by the industrial forces of production. This shed some light on Marx's peculiar metaphorical use of the term proletariat. In ancient Rome, the proletariat were citizens without property, but in bourgeois society, in modern society, property was based on labour, which was the first property, according to John Locke. Therefore, the idea of a worker without property was a peculiar self-contradiction. This is what it means when Marx writes in his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right that the proletariat is, quote, the dissolution of society. Society was constituted by the emancipated social relations of labour, and the proletariat signified the dissolution of those social relations of labour, all the while they demanded their reconstitution. I think in the Lukács that you read this week, there's a kind of pithy way of putting this early on about the kind of constitution of labour in bourgeois society, which is that the fate of the worker became the fate of society as a whole. So for Marx, the working class is a bourgeois class. All classes are, in this sense. This is not the same as saying that their representatives have sold out to bourgeois ideology because they have nice middle-class lives as trade union bosses. Not at all. Rather, it is the consciousness of the working class in its struggle for socialism, which is bourgeois as such, that is self-contradictory in capitalism. This is what Lukács was referring to in the aforementioned essay, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat. Quote, "The proletariat makes its appearance as the product of the capitalist social order. Thus, the proletariat shares with the bourgeoisie the reification of every aspect of its life. The objective reality of social existence is in its immediacy the same for both proletariat and bourgeoisie." End quote. Put differently, Marx has a bottom-up view of capitalism. It's not a top-down system of exploitation, which would not be something new in history necessarily, but a historically unprecedented problem of social domination, reproduced by the workers themselves. Marxism was not, as the AWL pamphlet avers, a coherent world outlook brought to the workers to give them working-class ideas instead of treacherous bourgeois ideas. Marxism was the historical, critical recognition of the working-class movement for socialism as a self-contradictory phenomenon of capitalism, showing how the phenomenon of the proletariat pointed beyond itself to its self-abolition. The emancipation of the proletariat will be the abolition, or more properly in the German term, the Aufhebung of the proletariat. This was the orthodox Marxist perspective of Rosa Luxemburg against Eduard Bernstein's revisionism in the revisionist dispute in the Second International around 1900. Bernstein thought that the growth of the working class movement for socialism and the achievement of reforms in capitalism represented a step towards socialism on a linear trajectory, on which it was necessary to keep pushing further. He had a linear progressive view of history. Luxemburg, however, thought that the growth of the mass movement for socialism and the achievement of reforms did not ameliorate the crisis of capitalism, but deepened it. The working class movement for socialism was participating in deepening the crisis of society. Thus, she accused Bernstein of being undialectical. For Luxemburg, following Marx, history in capitalism is not simply progressive, but regressive. This is what Walter Benjamin, following Luxemburg and Marx, called the retrogression of society. Luxemburg, like Lenin and Trotsky, thought that revisionism in the Second International was a symptom of the self-contradictory character of working-class socialism, pointing backwards to the tasks Marx recognized but which failed to be achieved in the revolutions of 1848, namely the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is kind of what I've tried to indicate with the bidirectional nature of capitalism and of regression, and also of the Socialist International kind of and the possible revolution pointing back to 1848. It's important to elucidate this because the exposition of class consciousness in the 1998 pamphlet leads to a linear progressive view of history. Right, so the idea of class consciousness being bought off by bourgeois ideas is conducive to the linear view of history which Luxemburg chastised or critiqued. According to the pamphlet, in the struggle between so-called bourgeois ideas and working class ideas, the working class ideas are driven on by the class struggle, or what it calls class society, as opposed to official society. And this struggle does not go away. Quote, there is permanent struggle. And it is because this class struggle is apparently permanent that, quote, the inner logic of history is with us, helping us, end quote. This is the opposite of Luxemburg's orthodox Marxist view, that the workers' demand for the value of their labour was self-contradictory. It is precisely the development of the class struggle that produces revisionism and reformism, and which more generally reproduces capitalism, deepening the crisis of society, and not some alien consciousness brought to befog workers by those who have become too accustomed to the comforts of a bureaucratic existence. It was this view that, quote, there is permanent struggle, and, quote, the inner logic of history is with us, helping us, that Walter Benjamin critiqued in his 1940 On the Concept of History. Benjamin, following the orthodox Marxism of Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, Lukács, and Korsch, among others, argued that in both the capitulation of the Second International leadership in the First World War and in Stalinism, Marxism had succumbed to faith in progress. As Max Horkheimer put it in his 1942 essay, The Authoritarian State, responding to Benjamin's On the Concept of History, as long as world history follows its logical course, it fails to fulfill its human destiny. Stalinism's faith in progress was a way of rationalizing defeat as victory, most famously in the declaration of socialism in one country, but also more generally in the epic of the 1930s Popular Front, in which Marxism was liquidated, but, quote, the struggle goes on. I think we kind of are familiar with this kind of disintegrated form of that Stalinist ethic today, this kind of Popular Front, struggle goes on kind of thing. It was against such Stalinism, which Trotsky called the antithesis of Bolshevism, that Trotsky urged his followers to call things by their right names, no matter how bitter that might be. Like Benjamin's image of the chess-playing automaton who always wins, this liquidation of Marxism to the exigencies of the present relied on an ugly theological hunchback hidden from view, faith in progress. This problem has also been addressed from the standpoint of Trotskyism in the New Left, which, as I mentioned before, had to similarly attempt to recover a critical consciousness of the left in history. For example, in his 1960 essay, What is Revolutionary Leadership?, Cliff Slaughter argues, quote, the elementary mistake of supposing that in the Marxist view consciousness and organization directly reflect economic need is one that must be conquered if there is to be a victorious revolution. As Slaughter points out, this is a key difference between the proletariat and other revolutionary classes in history, namely the revolutionary bourgeoisie. The proletariat needs historical consciousness in an historically specific way. He continues, there is no repository of this consciousness, and no guarantee of its necessary constant development in theory and practice, other than the proletarian party. To talk about the working class itself as an undifferentiated, potentially revolutionary whole is to substitute myth for reality. Furthermore, this understanding of the permanent struggle on the side of the working class liquidates the need for a socialist party, aiming for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead, the struggle of the working class, helped by the inner logic of history, needs to be protected from the bourgeois ideas of its leaders. That is in the conception presented here in the AWL pamphlet. The pamphlet calls this process resistance. Quote, "The very possibility of such resistance depends on the prior existence of the unofficial networks of revolutionary militants in the labour movement, consciously at war with the officials. This unofficial network of revolutionary militants concedes a lot, too much, to the exigencies of the 1930s Stalinist Popular Front and the entryism, however understood, of Trotskyists in the mid to late 20th century, i.e. to the absence of a political party for socialism." So I guess what I'm arguing here is that the way that they're explaining the history of the Second International is actually a capitulation to kind of lowered horizons in the present. So to make it seem as if that what they're doing now is what Lenin and Luxemburg were doing 100 years ago. Contrary to the account of the crisis of the Second International given in this pamphlet, Luxemburg, Lenin and Trotsky were not such an unofficial network in the Second International resisting the bourgeois ideas of its leadership in Bebel and Kautsky. As Marxists, they sought to uphold the immanent dialectical critique of the class struggle and the party itself as phenomena of capitalism. Moreover, they sought, and in Lenin's case took, leadership of the mass socialist parties in their political struggle for power, because Marxists were about the revolutionary struggle for power through the mass socialist party and not resistance within state capitalist parties. Now, it may be the case that in the absence of a mass socialist party, which is the case, Marxists are no longer engaged in the struggle for power, but must recognize that in fact they are just engaged in propaganda. Indeed, Atlantis has sunk, and some Marxist organizations have been micro-propaganda groups at best for almost a century now. But to argue that this was the perspective of Luxemburg, Lenin and Trotsky in the Second International is to confuse the exigencies of propaganda with theory and history, thus liquidating Marxism as the high point of historical consciousness to tactics in the present. For Marx, class was not a sociological category, but something politically constituted, first by the Chartist Movement in the UK. Without a socialist party, the working class ceases to exist as a political subject. This was Luxemburg's point against Bernstein. He said, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. For Luxemburg, the movement was nothing without the political goal of socialism to constitute it. In the absence of the political party for socialism, class turns out to be a racket, one racket among many, vying for a place within the state. To quote Cliff Slaughter again, to talk about the working class itself as an undifferentiated, potentially revolutionary whole is to substitute myth for reality. With Brexit, for example, there are leftists on both sides of the divide arguing that remain or leave are in the interests of the working class. Either one may be true sociologically, but this has nothing to do with Marxism or socialism, without which the working class is not subjectively constituted as such. This would be kind of a theme in Lukács, this question of constituting the subjective factor in history. Such cold detachment about the risks of people's livelihood may seem barbaric, but Marxism is not about moral indignation. As G.M. Tamas has written in an essay called Telling the Truth About Class, quote, Freud has eloquently described resistances to psychoanalysis. Intuitive resistance to Marxism is no less widespread, even among socialists. It is emotionally and intellectually difficult to be a Marxist, since it goes against the grain of moral indignation, which is, of course, the main reason people become socialists. If Marxism itself is subject to regression, then it is difficult to see what it would mean for people today to be the heirs of Atlantis, to be the preserved and pickled inheritors of 1917. This is related to the problem Leon Trotsky faced in the 1930s, as he put it in Stalinism and Bolshevism, a short essay, how to maintain ideological positions while having to retreat from political positions. As Walter Benjamin put it, even the dead are not safe. Of course, the Atlantis metaphor is kind of ironic. Atlantis never did exist. In Plato's Timaeus and Critias, it's a fictional island in an allegory on the hubris of nations, serving to illustrate not the qualities of Atlantis, but of the ancient Athenian Republic, which defeats Atlantis single-handedly, sending it back to the deep. Okay, that was my presentation. Let's see if I can turn this around. It's not going to show anything. So, questions, comments? What do you guys think?
First of all, thank you for giving the great speech. I think it's one of those first panel talks that participated in Platypus. At the beginning of the presentation, before the presentation, I think it says that Platypus has rejected two kinds of debate. One is about human nature, the other is about servo subjectivity. How should we understand them, and on what basis we should reject or debate with them?
Mm-hmm. So the reference there was to Marx, but and kind of via Moshe Postone, who's a figure coming out of the New Left, and the problem, we have to think about what's the problem that this is like trying to address in the first place. The problem is, what is the consciousness that can subjectively constitute an agent for overcoming capitalism? And the peculiar way that Marx talks about the proletariat as being constituted, as being the liquidation of bourgeois social relations of labour, but also being based upon it, right? So that they're workers who demand the value of their labour, and at the same time, it's that process that's undermining the value of labour and driving the crisis of society that capitalism is. So it's not a problem of top-down oppression in a kind of traditional sense, but is a problem that's produced bottom-up, right? That the workers' demands for work are actually driving the problem further. And so this is why I quoted Marx to the effect of the aim of the proletariat is to abolish itself rather than to actualize itself, right? Now, this is obviously poses a tricky problem, and there have been various other responses to that problem on the history of the left, both in kind of pre-Marxian socialism, in utopian socialism and so on, but also in the 20th century after the kind of failure of Marxism and in its disintegration. And two of those ways are those that Postone points out, right? That firstly, an argument based on the idea that there's some ontological human nature which can be appealed to against the exploitation of capitalism, and that Marx rejects such a kind of argument based on human nature. And the other one is to the idea that, well, somewhere there's an agent, an agent for social change, which has not yet been consumed into this labour market, essentially, in the same way, right? That's not constituted by the demand to reproduce its own value as labour. And that this might be found in the third world, it might be found among women, it might be found, there are all kinds of different ways that it's put, particularly in the 1960s, in the aftermath of the 1960s with the New Left. And Marxism rejects both of these arguments. Now, obviously, when we come across Marxism today, generally it's one of these arguments that we're actually presented with. I think generally when people are presented in the academic classroom or by kind of sectarian Marxist groups or kind of other figures on the left with an account of what Marxism is about, they actually make some kind of appeal to one of these two arguments. That the working class is some kind of identity that has to, is, you know, it was in the argument of the pamphlet that I was addressing, that there's the consciousness of the class struggle, and that's kind of bought off by bourgeois ideas, and so the point is just to resist those bourgeois ideas and keep going, which would presume that somehow that class consciousness is outside of the problem rather than inside of it. Or you get some kind of account of exploitation as being an affront to human dignity, which then becomes a kind of ahistorical category. And what Marx is showing is that those kinds of values are actually the kind of liberal ideals of bourgeois society itself. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. Kind of. I have to understand it through more readings.
Okay. Well, I mean, you can ask more questions or follow up if there was something I said that wasn't clear.
Might be helpful perhaps to
Mhm.
clarify. You know, how Marx would have understood human nature, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've touched on obviously these are both like seems to be reified sort of forms. You know, they're like you know, what they're sort of like misses the way in which Marx obviously following the sort of you know, history of the long history of like bourgeois sort of philosophy understood you know, human nature is something that can be changed, and obviously the how under capitalism this then appears, you know, like unattainable, and this is sort of where this sort of like appeal to like human nature comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that the I think that the Lukács, I don't know if you guys read that this week, the first part of the reification essay. Yeah. And in the beginning he's talking about that kind of total transformation of a society from one in which people are bound in a kind of organic process of production to one of reification. And I think what Padre is getting at is this idea of the emergence of bourgeois society as being this, the kind of the birth of the idea of freedom in the world and in history, and that the liberation of people from feudal social relations to social relations based on labour creates a infinite potential, like kind of realizes the infinite potential of human development, that people can become what they want rather than be what they are, and that this process of becoming is kind of not, Marx uses this phrase, not measured by any previously established yardstick, and that this is human nature is utterly transformable in this way, and that the kind of moment that's indicated by the Industrial Revolution on the timeline is because it's a crisis of that society in which freedom is being pursued, the pursuit of happiness on the basis of social relations of labour, and that comes into a crisis in the Industrial Revolution, that the the idea that you're producing yourself and developing your nature in an undetermined way, in a way that determines itself, that society is like subject and object of itself, seems to become like a farce. And people then reach back to... So the idea of human nature as an explanation for things actually emerges as a symptom of capitalism in the 19th century. So, for example, you get symptoms like Malthus, the idea that there's a kind of natural level to there's a natural level of poverty and to human consumption and the size of society as a natural limit to this growth. Marx picking up the liberal bourgeois tradition is of the view of the unlimited potential of human self-transformation. He sees Malthus then appearing as a kind of symptom of the crisis of that society in capitalism that makes it seem like there's this natural limit. That's kind of one ideological way of explaining the crisis. And so, far from discovering a kind of eternal law of human history, Malthus is an expression of the crisis of bourgeois social relations in capitalism. I mean, one thing I might point out is the some of the other timelines that are on this chart, and maybe talk about what those are doing. So the first one there is the Century of Marxism, which is an article in the Platypus Review from Chris Catrone, and so this is kind of charting from 1873. Hi, Gleb. Charting from 1873 to 1973 as this kind of century of Marxism. The first kind of 50 years, the first half of that is essentially the trajectory of the Second International through to the end of the kind of revolutionary period in Germany that fails in 1923. And obviously the second 50 years there are then a lot more dubious in their account in their claim to be Marxism. And that kind of thesis is partly in response to Alain Badiou in the communist hypothesis, which is addressed in another article by Chris Catrone called the Marxist hypothesis, which essentially goes against what I'm trying to be. So what I presented here is this kind of account of history where there are these two major breaks. One is the advent of modern bourgeois society, and the other is the Industrial Revolution and 1848 as the kind of political crisis of that society. What Badiou says is that there's this kind of flat idea of communism, which stretches all the way back to Jesus, and which has these kinds of moments of events or eruptions in history. And that there are two key periods for Badiou in terms of thinking about the modern instantiation of this communist hypothesis. One is 1792 to 1871. So from the from the kind of latter part of the French Revolution through to the Paris Commune. And then from 1917, so from the Russian Revolution through to 1976, essentially to the end of Maoism, right? And Badiou's coming from a Maoist tradition in some sense. So what I've kind of indicated here that what that leaves out is Marxism, precisely as indicated by the first timeline, right? This kind of period of the Socialist International, and I would kind of say that this question mark of like missing out Marxism in this way is explainable because through what's missed out in the first section of the Badiou trajectory from 1792 to 1871, i.e. 1848. The idea that 1792 is commensurate with 1871 is precisely against the Marxist hypothesis, which is that 1848 signals a total crisis in the idea of bourgeois revolution, kind of inherited from the French Revolution, particularly on the continent, but also, as I've indicated, from the American Revolution and the English Revolution. And so it's that kind of absence of 1848 as a turning point, and this kind of way of thinking of Marx as the philosopher of 1848, or the theorist of 1848, that makes the Marxism of the intervening period seem very obscure and therefore unimportant to Badiou. What's interesting about the timeline given by the McGamner thesis in Unite the Left, which I addressed in the paper, is I quoted twice from this Cliff Slaughter essay, which we'll read in the reading group next term, What is Revolutionary Leadership? And I particularly chose that Cliff Slaughter essay because McGamner first became a Trotskyist in Cliff Slaughter's organisation in the Socialist Labour League in the 60s in the UK. And this point that Slaughter makes about the myth of the working class as an undifferentiated, like, revolutionary subject being something that we need to dispel. I think what's interesting about the way that they periodise 1838 to 1938 is that it becomes about the labour movement and the class struggle. So it seems that there's a kind of a constant thing called the labour movement, and that it's then sold out by its leadership. But that somewhere there's this work, and that's the kind of thesis that's put forward in the pamphlet of working class ideas that come from class society as opposed to bourgeois ideas that come from official society, and that are somehow this kind of like dupe. That kind of argument is based on seeing history in this way, based on seeing the important determinants as this kind of 100-year period of class struggle, and that then it's the class struggle that kind of disintegrates. I think the problem there is that it avoids the question of Marxism or the way that Cliff Slaughter puts it, of revolutionary leadership. That kind of, part of my provocation in the piece is that the orientation as entryist towards the Labour Party, which the AWL have, is condoned by such a theory, because you say, well, the labour movement always exists, there is the labour movement, and we have to be in it, with it, struggling to throw out the bourgeois misleadership of the labour movement. So that kind of account of history is important to what people are saying, not just their account of what Marxism is, but what their account of themselves as Marxists in the present is. What do you guys think?
What do these timelines tell us about the state of the left presently, or what do you think is sort of, do they indicate, you touched on that somewhat in terms of like the AWL's relationship with the Labour Party, but what these give any indications of how we got to where we are now and where we might be going?
Say 1998 to 2018.
Uh-huh. So how it relates to the state of the left now and where we might be going? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so one thing I wanted to point out with this is that the kind of attempt to rethink the meaning of history from the standpoint of the present and its significance for the left, which is sort of attempted in the pamphlet written in 1998, is not kind of what we're seeing on the left at the moment. That there's a foreshortening of historical consciousness and even of the question of history per se. So it kind of becomes this, rather than like trying to differentiate different moments, they kind of pile up in this cumulative fashion. And, so I was trying to, I think one of the important things that Platypus does is to take left organisations very seriously, to take their claims as genuine and to want to elicit from them their best kind of reasoning, argument, explanation, the best that they can give. And so kind of presenting this moment of reflection that happens around the Blair moment on the left to what's happening today was a kind of a way of doing that. What your question does raise, though, which is shown on the diagram, is this question of the millennial left. What is that, and where did it go? Where has it gone, and is it going anywhere? And the kind of crisis that it's come into in 2018, or really since 2016, with the Trump election and with Brexit, and the turn towards the Democrats in America, or the kind of more pronounced turn towards the Democrats in America and the Labour Party here as kind of two key examples. Although obviously this is an international phenomenon. I think what's interesting about the I recently got the issue. I don't know if you know this, but the publishers of Jacobin magazine in America have bought the old Tribune magazine, which was a Labour Party sort of left Labour Party publication founded in the 1930s. That was kind of let's say had a kind of important moment in the 50s and 60s, and they bought it and kind of revamped it and relaunched it. It was kind of lost in the weeds for a while. And the editorial introduction, and it's supposed to be this like galvanizing Corbyn trying to organize a series of ideas around the contemporary Labour left. And the editorial introduction is titled "The Old and the New." And what you get is this kind of view of history as taking all the bits we want and adding it up, right? In this, as if the history isn't disintegrating, or as if we can just kind of progress in this manner. And I think you see that I've on the line just above that, I've indicated kind of transformations in different forms of state capitalism since Bonapartism in the aftermath of 1848. And what's interesting with the idea of socialism that you get with the millennial left is that it's some kind of cumulative bits of wreckage from all of those. So you get harkbacks to progressivism, right? This kind of 1910s to 1920s phenomenon of early attempts, or a particular kind of attempt with Theodore Roosevelt in the US, or with Lloyd George in the UK, right? Who had the people's budget, and was going to overcome unemployment forever, with a kind of progressivism, a kind of liberal progressivism that uses the state to control the excesses of capitalism in some way. So you get people harking back to that and calling it socialism. And this term progressivism, I don't think was used so much on the kind of soft left, maybe like 5 years ago even. And then obviously you get people talking about the New Deal and the welfare state, right? We're going to revamp the welfare state in the UK with Labour apparently, and people in the US are calling for a New Deal or a Green New Deal or a European New Deal. Then you get the kind of identity politics that comes with neoliberalism as well, and you get a kind of view of society that really is conditioned by the neoliberal moment in some ways. And so the vision is this kind of accumulation of the past, the old and the new, as they put it in the introduction to Tribune, rather than an attempt to kind of pass out a theory of regression, right? An idea that history is not kind of adding up in this progressive way, but is regressing and disintegrating, and our consciousness of the problem is disintegrating along with that. So, Platypus has set out to kind of work through the history in that way and to brush against the grain. There's this phrase from Walter Benjamin, to brush history against the grain, and that it might require the leverage of a barge pole. Which is precisely to brush against the way the left is trying to accumulate history, or that history seems to be accumulating in accounts of history in the present, which are about one's theory of the present and how they're going to change it and so on. So I think that the left's attempt to articulate a historical consciousness is disintegrating, and has disintegrated within the lifetime of Platypus, and so since 2006 in the past 10 years, and that means well, I'm not sure what that means, but we're trying to kind of track that problem, I guess. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does well.
What do you think?
I mean, there's sort of that interesting question of, taking things like progressivism and the New Deal and the welfare state and treating them as victories, not just as like as unqualified successes, which seems sort of, on the one hand, very ahistorical. I mean, certainly, like in the 1930s, 1960s, there was a lot of the sort of organized far left in Western Europe and in North America that was very opposed to the creation of welfare state institutions. For this reason, they saw them as just trying to prevent capitalism's decay. I mean, of course, I don't really think that we should be upholding, sort of people like Francis Fox Piven or anyone like that. But I think that is an interesting kind of problem. I think certainly also the disintegration and sort of how short memory has gotten has been. You sort of talked about the trying to rebuild or reconstitute the welfare state, and what that looks like practically speaking. If you look at the demands of activists and Momentum, or sort of the American progressive movement, it's almost like the Momentum basically wants to return to the welfare state circa 2002. It's not even like an attempt to really transform it in any sort of fundamental way. It's really just sort of keep it more or less the same, just spend more money. And they're not really aware of the fact that they're just trying to turn the clock back about 16 years.
I think that's part of this cumulative effect, which is that you can't just simply add these things up, but they appear retrospectively through what's come afterwards. So that people are talking about the welfare state from this kind of perspective of neoliberalism in a way, and similarly going back to progressivism and Dom, what do you make?
I've got a question about something on the chat actually. It's kind of related to this discussion about the role of the state in the politics and capitalism. It was post neoliberalism at the end there. And I was wondering
Yeah.
question. I should ask you the question of what
Yeah.
this means. And what is post? Is it that I saw an article in the New Statesman the other day. Is it the revenge of the nation state? Is this post-neoliberalism? Is it demagogues around the world? Is it Erdogan? Is it Trump? And what's the role of the left? What do you think the left is going to? What shape the left might take in this epoch?
So obviously we're like living through a period of immense political change and turmoil, and it's hard for people to imagine the kind of the worldview that's kind of coming into being and the kind of new form that capitalism is taking. So that's why I've just kind of called it post-neoliberalism and put a question mark. I would say probably terms like populism are not that helpful. I think this idea of the return of the nation state is not necessarily that helpful. It obscures something. It obscures the point that neoliberalism was obviously based on the nation state. So in the same way that in the same way that the neoliberalism itself obscured the fact that it was still a form of kind of welfare state. And the point of the way I've laid this out on the chart as kind of being different forms of Bonapartism is to say that post-neoliberalism will still be some kind of form of state management of capitalism. There will be various changes, and some of them are apparent with Trump, the kind of renegotiation of trade deals, and the immigration question comes under that. It's a kind of renegotiation of a trade deal. The Brexit whole thing is a renegotiation in this way. I think what's important to pay attention to is not necessarily the policies of these phenomena. So not to consider any of these forms as a set of policies, but as a politics, as a way of managing capitalism through democracy. That there are kind of the constitution of different constituencies which come together to support different measures and different forms of attempting to restrain capitalism and to manage it. So I think that what's important to pay attention to this question of, well, where are we going? What's this post-neoliberalism? Is to pay attention to the politics in that sense. How are electoral coalitions realigning? How are people's self-explanations for things changing? Right, so people will often be doing the same things, but explaining them in different ways, or using new kinds of politics to explain them. So it might be that, for example, that a lot of Trump's policies are actually continuation of Obama policies, but that there's been a political change. The meaning of them has changed politically, and that's the kind of important thing to pay attention to. But the other thing that's kind of indicated by the timeline there is how the various phases on the left sort of come a cropper on the shoals of these transformations. So that the old left gets washed up on the shores of the welfare state, it capitulates to it. And that the new left, which kind of protested against the welfare state, gets washed up on the shores of neoliberalism, to which it kind of led to in some way, and that the millennial left, in this way in which it kind of chastises everything as neoliberalism, is actually kind of washing up its own opportunity on the shores of this change. So rather than recognizing the change for what it is, it protests against it, and you get on the left arguments about kind of going back to 2008 or some kind of version of that. In a way, there's a lot of like Blair nostalgia in the Corbyn movement. Corbyn is, because it's like Blair's fatal sin was the Iraq War, and that's what Corbyn redeems.
2017 general election was run on the same slogan by Labour as the 1997 general election.
Right, for the many, not the few.
Yeah, like they used the exact same
Yeah.
sort of just messaging
Yeah,
and everything.
yeah. And the question of what happens to the left is kind of obscure. I guess Platypus is trying to track how these symptoms are accounting for themselves in the present and what that means. How they give an account of themselves as symptoms, and how to kind of feel the grain of history, how to feel the regression. Because I think one of the things I tried to point out in the presentation is that, like, if there's this regression going on in Marxism from the high point in the attempted revolution in the aftermath of World War I, from the kind of aftermath of that through to the present, one of the problems is how to know that regression is happening. How can we recognize it? That's why I addressed this question of the faith in progress of always winning, that the struggle's always going on, and that it's on our side, and that's why we'll win. That kind of makes the regression kind of not palpable. It hides, it masks the feeling of it in some way. To go back to the very beginning, where I posed this question of Platypus as a project for self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. The question of, after 2018 of post-neoliberalism will be what kind of opportunity is history going to throw up, and what will be, if Platypus is a pre-political project, an educational project, what will it mean to end that and begin a political project? Those are some of the kind of questions that are thrown up by this change, but not in any kind of immediate way. In a very obscure way, and one that's highly mediated by the forms of appearance that the left itself is taking. And Platypus is part of that symptomology as well, right? Emerging as it does in 2006 in the kind of crisis around the Iraq War. Is it Kieran?
Yes.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could clarify the 3 question marks just on the left-hand side of the...
So this line at the bottom is charting regression, and I've tried to show that, like capitalism, it has this kind of bi-directional movement in history. This kind of goes to the fourth timeline on the bottom, which I haven't mentioned yet, which is the Century of Counter-Revolution, which is another essay by Chris Couture in the Platypus Review. And it's a thesis about how, in the aftermath of the failure of revolution after 1923, let's say, the regression in the consciousness of the left doesn't just affect kind of Marxism and socialism, but it starts to eat away at the bourgeois revolutionary tradition which Marxism took for granted. So the 3 question marks there are kind of parallel to the dates 1688, 1776, and 1789. Were those revolutions? was bourgeois society the freedom dawning on the world, as Hegel put it about Rousseau? Was Kant, the Kant essay that we read in the Platypus reading group, the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan standpoint, was that just a lie? And that, especially from the perspective of the contemporary left, which often treats those things as I don't know, like white privilege, or in terms of identity politics, or as being mere shams, that the consequences of the failure of Marxism begin to eat up the whole of history, particularly this like bourgeois revolutionary account, that was something that Marxists once took for granted, and that's what's becoming obscure. And I think you can see that with how the different kind of timelines, the one that I've addressed and the Badiou one, kind of are ambiguous at best about the meaning of the bourgeois revolutions. Either they're assimilated to a kind of history of permanent struggle that goes both before and after, or they're kind of ignored as being like not important. And part of what's become kind of central for Platypus is the recovery of the bourgeois revolutionary tradition as understood by Marxism. The other way of thinking about that, I referred to Walter Benjamin in the presentation, and he has this image in the theses on the concepts of history, which again will be in the reading group at the end of next term, of the history starting to appear like this wreckage. That's how it appears, the angel of history, but not Benjamin's perspective, but this one that he's kind of trying to present, and that the storm that's kind of throwing this wreckage is blowing all the way from Eden, from paradise. And so it kind of implies that it seems, from the standpoint of the failure of Marxism, that the whole of human civilization was a big mistake, right? That we should never have left the Rousseauian state of nature, that kind of hypothetical argument, but that we should never have left the Garden of Eden, and that civilization, which from the standpoint of bourgeois society, Hegel took to be, the unfolding of freedom in history, that the meaning of history became like this goal of freedom, now seems to have been like a big mistake, and not to have pointed to freedom at all. I think to go back to that question of human nature, that's an interesting example of that. That the Malthus perspective of which is about kind of fixing human nature, says this whole freedom project was a big mistake and it was never real, and this idea of history unfolding unlimited human potential, no. And so Marxism really is the only way of actually upholding that perspective from the bourgeois revolutions. That's the kind of the thesis that's put forward there. The regression thesis is kind of central to Platypus, and particularly with Adorno and Benjamin at the end of the syllabus. But even with the stuff that you guys will have just read with Marx on 1848 and Bonapartism, there he's already thinking about how society retrogresses, right, in its crisis, when society becomes managed by the state. In this way, there's its history is no longer progressing in this linear way, in freedom, in the sense as Hegel would have taken it to be. And it's not that Marx thought that wasn't true for Hegel, but that it was, but that it's become in crisis, in a new problem, i.e. post-industrial revolution. So that the kind of regression thesis, although it appears central to this idea of the fate of the left after 1923 or after 1918 or whenever we want to put a date on it, is actually kind of central to Marxism as a theory of history, going all the way back to 1848.
Prompt actually will definitely come to, at the start of next term, the idea from the Karl Korsch essay, the idea for a Marxist, theory of the history of Marxism.
Right, the Marxist critique of Marxism. Yeah, that's Karl Korsch in the Marxism of philosophy, and yeah, again, trying to take, I think, and that's another point of the piece that I presented, which is that all of these things, like the Socialist Party, the demand for socialism, the working class as a politically constituted subject, Marxism itself, all of these are phenomena of capitalism, and therefore they require self-critique in a historically specific way. Right, in a way that's historically unprecedented, and that Marxism is nothing but the recognition of that need. It's not some alternative principle, it's not some way of managing society, it's the recognition of the historically specific need for the self-critique of the working class movement for socialism. Because as a product of capitalism, it is self-contradictory. It's subject to reification, as Lukács will have it. And so when Korsch says in 1923, we need a Marxist critique of Marxism, and he's building on Rosa Luxemburg and her critique of the SPD, then that's kind of taking up that same point. To re-articulate the Marxist dialectic for his own time. And that the dialectic is that point about forms of appearance being self-contradictory in a historically specific way to capitalism that requires a self-critique. So Marx as the critic of socialism rather than its most ardent advocate. That's been lost on the left, that perspective, because in an attempt to kind of accommodate to the depth of the defeat, the left has identified positively with one or other of the various aspects. So it's identified either with the party, or with the class, or with socialism. And Marxism never considered itself identical with any of these things, but always observed their non-identity and observed them as self-contradictory phenomena of capitalism. And again, to emphasize a point at the end, that's the point G.M. Tamas is making when he says that Marxism goes against the grain of moral indignation. And therefore it's difficult to be a Marxist, because the main reason why people become socialists, or probably one of the main, is this moral indignation, as he puts it. So there's a kind of resistance to Marxism in the way he describes it. Yeah.
I've got a question about this idea of bourgeois society, which later comes into crisis with the Industrial Revolution. I think a lot of people, especially my age, I don't know if I'm maybe post-millennial, I think I missed the millennial pedigree by 2 years, I'm not sure. But I think maybe the millennials too, they kind of are very skeptical of this idea of bourgeois society. universal history, this sort of cosmopolitan point of view. I mean, the Methodological camp was also theorizing about race and justifying colonialism on like a racial basis, or help justify colonialism. Adam Smith was just like writing about in his time, colonialism akin to the Roman model of colonialism, which was about domination. And I guess a lot of people feel like bourgeois society there's no sharp distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism in the sense that it's still domination, I guess. So overall, you thought about that? I guess where do we really see the exceptionality of bourgeois society? Where can we see it happen rather than just in philosophy and ideas? Was there actually a period of time where people could transform themselves? Because of course, could women, for instance, do it at this time?
Okay, so a couple of points. One is that the part of the problem of how bourgeois society becomes flattened and not seen as this kind of major change, unprecedented change in human history, is because of a misunderstanding about capitalism, which I try to address in the presentation, which is that capitalism should not be considered as a problem of top-down domination, not a problem of hierarchy in the sense of the oppression of feudal peasants by their lords, but as a form of social domination, which is a different problem and is one that is produced from the bottom up. And that kind of problem is only possible from the basis of bourgeois society. That's only possible. That kind of problem is only conceivable from the basis in which society has become a whole, a totality, to use Lukács's term, in a historically unprecedented way in bourgeois society. So the third estate was nothing, wants to be something, will be everything. That formulation of the Abbé says, the idea that the third estate becomes everything, that means that then the problem in capitalism is like total and not a case as it was in the French Revolution, in the kind of bourgeois revolutions of throwing off the two upper castes of the clergy and the monarchy, the aristocracy, who were parasites on productive society, on those who labour. The other part of your question is about whether bourgeois society was ever free, I think, right?
I suppose so, yeah.
Obviously, in the case of women, for example, you do see the emancipation of women become a question for the first time in human history in the 18th century, even in the 17th century. The impact of someone like Locke on Mary Wollstonecraft is like immeasurable. And
slavery.
Sorry? And slavery, right? The abolition of slavery, the idea of the abolition of slavery, for the first time. In the article, The Century of Counter-Revolution, that's kind of to do with this question and mapped on the chart, Chris Catrone quotes from a Robert Frost poem called The Black Cottage, which basically has this line about the idea that all men are created equal is a hard mystery that Thomas Jefferson problem that he posed to us, right? So the American Revolution is posing this problem of the idea that all men are created equal, in which is implied all women as well, and that every generation will have to reconsider that problem for its time. Or we could take the easy way and say, well, it was never true, and so therefore we don't need to reconsider what that means. And I think that what you're kind of expressing about a generational kind of sense of the lack of meaning in the bourgeois revolutions is the idea that, well, it was never true, so we don't have to worry ourselves with like reconsidering it. But actually, that's the evidence, so to speak, of the idea of freedom dawning on the world. Obviously, an important distinction to make is between the is and the ought. So it's not that, 1688, bam, everyone's free. Freedom is not a thing that you kind of have, but is this thing that is pursued, this task, in and through society. And so it's a question that develops in and through society, and so it's not a kind of state that we can say, well, did they achieve it or not? And therefore, what does that mean? And what was I going to say about that? The idea of freedom as a task, basically. And so that's an important kind of distinction to make when thinking about the revolutionary character of bourgeois modernity. But the other important point to make is that this idea of Marx as the immanent dialectical critique. So Marx doesn't have a labour theory of value, he has an immanent dialectical critique of the already existing labour theory of value. Marx doesn't have a theory of socialism, he has an immanent dialectical critique of the already existing socialism, which is a form of bourgeois consciousness, right? Is trying to attain to the ideals of bourgeois society. Thinking through the relationship of Marxism to the bourgeois revolutions needs to be done in that way, i.e. not as a negation of it in the kind of one-sided sense, but as an immanent dialectical critique, seeing how its crisis and contradiction points beyond itself. So the other point I was going to make before about about freedom as a task is the particular wording in the American Constitution of the pursuit of happiness, rather than like life, liberty, and happiness. If that makes sense. There's something there about a kind of unfolding task in history that was like present in their consciousness of what they were doing and why. And that kind of plays out in all kinds of questions about, the role of slavery in the founding of America. Because the founding fathers clearly thought that slavery would be abolished, and Jefferson himself, although he did own slaves, was kind of would have been shocked to find that it hadn't been overcome in and through society, not long after his death. And that the idea that all men are created equal is the kind of the foundation on which we think social emancipation at all. That all thought about freedom and social emancipation on the left and in Marxism and whatever kind of variety of the left today is based on that transformation of modern society as such in a fundamental way, so that the tasks of the present are obscured by not recognizing that. We've got sort of 5 or 10 more minutes. If anyone's got any last burning thoughts or questions. Gleb? Okay, well, I'll just, I'm conscious that I talked a lot, but if there aren't any more questions, then we can wrap up. But I just wanted to kind of recap by sort of thinking about how I was trying to present this particular engagement with the AWL, and we recently hosted someone we met there on our 1918 panel. We obviously hope to engage with everyone on the left, to host the conversation on the left, right? This is the kind of the raison d'etre of Platypus and the way we carry out our mission. So I wanted to kind of present this as an example of how we might engage with the left, how the education that we're sort of receiving and teaching in the reading group is applicable in this way, right? That it's not just about we sit down in the reading group and we read the text, but that we're actually trying to make an intervention at the level of ideas in contemporary discussion about history and the left, and that we should do more of it in London, going to attend left events, seeing what kinds of things people are talking about, what kind of questions are they raising, what kind of questions do we have in response, how does it kind of jar or fit with the Marxism that we're reading in the reading group, or the bourgeois history? Do they talk about this stuff? Do they not? How do they respond if we bring it up? And that's a way of trying to, and then we have them speak on our panels and write for the Platypus Review and so on, and that's a way of making regression palpable in the present, which is the task of Platypus. All right, thanks. See, how do I end this thing?